Welcome to our Wild West story. Where are you watching from? Please subscribe and let's dive in. The dust of Salvation, Texas, tasted like desperation and old grief. For Jedidiah Stone, it was the bitter flavor of a life lived alone on a sprawling, unforgiving ranch. For Clara Hayes, it was the final, stinging reminder that she had nowhere left to go. She clutched her daughter Sarah's hand, the little girl's knuckles white in her grip. They were a pair of lost souls in a town that had no time for them. Jed saw them from the porch of the general store. He was a man built of hard angles and calloused hands, his face weathered by sun and sorrow. He hadn't spoken to a woman his own age in 2 years, not since the fever had taken his wife and left him with a daughter, Lily, who was fading as quickly as the prairie flowers in a drought. Lily, a wisp of a girl with a fierce need for a mother's touch, was the sole reason he was in town today. She needed a new dress, but what she truly needed was a family. Jed watched the widow and her daughter. The woman, Clara, had a fire in her eyes that belied her ragged clothes. She was haggling over the price of a loaf of bread, her voice low and proud. When the storekeeper shook his head, she straightened her shoulders and led her daughter away, chin high, a storm brewing in her defiant gaze. A thought so radical it felt like a thunderclap struck Jed. He walked toward them, his spurs jingling on the boardwalk like a grim bell. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble. Clara flinched, pulling Sarah behind her. "I don't need charity, sir." Jed stopped a few feet away, hat in hand. "I'm not offering charity. I'm offering a home." She stared at him, her brow furrowed with suspicion. "I'm afraid I don't follow." "My name is Jedidiah Stone," he said, gesturing to the distant hills where his ranch lay. "I have 1,000 acres, more cattle than I can count, and a daughter who needs a mother." He glanced at Sarah, who peeked out from behind her mother's skirt. "It seems you have a daughter who needs a home." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. The words hung in the air, blunt and without pretense. It was a business proposal, a cold-hearted trade of needs. Her pride screamed at her to refuse, to walk away and face the uncertainty of the road alone. But she looked down at Sarah, her small, trusting face, and the cry of her pride was silenced by a mother's love. "It would be a marriage of convenience?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jed nodded. "Nothing more. You'd have a roof over your head, food on the table, and my respect. Your daughter and mine, they'd have each other, and a family." Clara took a deep breath, the dust filling her lungs. The choice was a bitter pill, but survival had taught her to swallow what she must. "When do we leave?" The journey to the ranch was a quiet one. The silence between Jed and Clara was filled with the rhythmic creak of the wagon and the silent curiosity of the two little girls. Lily, Jed's daughter, was a delicate, pale thing with eyes the color of a summer sky. She sat beside Jed, clutching a worn-out doll. Sarah, with her dark hair and bright, inquisitive eyes, was the opposite, a tiny force of nature. When they arrived, the stone ranch house was bigger than Clara had imagined. It was a sturdy 2-story structure, well-kept but empty of a woman's touch. The rooms were clean but impersonal, like a museum dedicated to a life long gone. Jed led them inside. "The girls can share a room. You can take the master bedroom." Clara's heart seized. "I can sleep in one of the other rooms, Jedidiah. This is your home." "It's our home now," he corrected, his gaze steady. "We'll be a family in name and in deed. It wouldn't look right otherwise." And so, their life began. Clara took to running the household with a fierce efficiency, her presence filling the silent rooms with the warmth of a fire and the smell of fresh-baked bread. Jed worked the ranch from sunup to sundown. They communicated in short, practical sentences about supplies, about the girls, about the coming weather. There were no kind words, no romantic gestures. This was a partnership born of necessity, but the real magic happened between the children. Lily, so quiet and withdrawn, blossomed under Sarah's boisterous energy. They spent their days chasing grasshoppers, building forts from old blankets, and giggling in their shared room long after the lanterns had been put out. Jed and Clara would often find themselves standing in the doorway, watching them. In those moments, a fragile thread of warmth would pass between the adults, a silent acknowledgement of the good they had done for their daughters. Their fragile peace was tested by the cruel gossip of the nearest town. On a supply run, Jed overheard two men in the saloon talking about him. "Did you hear? Jedidiah Stone married a stray he picked up off the street. Got two girls now, too. Seems he just couldn't be bothered to raise his own daughter properly." Jed's hands clenched into fists. He had married Clara to give his daughter a mother, not to be the subject of cruel jokes. He turned and faced the men, his eyes as cold as a winter snap. The words died in their throats as they saw the look on his face. Jed was a man of few words, but the silence he commanded was a force of nature. Back on the ranch, Clara was fighting her own battle. The work was endless, and the weight of her grief for her late husband felt heavier than ever. One evening, she broke down, the tears falling silently as she kneaded dough in the kitchen. Jed found her there. He didn't say anything. He just stood there for a long moment before walking over to the stove and stoking the fire. The popping and crackling of the wood was the only sound. "The girls are good, Clara," he said, his voice soft. "Look at Lily. She smiles now. You did that." His words, simple and true, were the only comfort she had received in years. She nodded, wiping her eyes on her apron, and continued her work. They were not husband and wife in the traditional sense, but they were a team. They had a shared purpose, and it was a powerful one. A month later, a vicious storm blew through, tearing down the barn and scattering the harvest. The work of a year was gone in a single night. The next day, the men of the neighboring ranches rode in. They were a rough and tumble lot, but they understood the unspoken code of the prairie. When a neighbor falls, you help them up. Jed, Clara, and the girls worked alongside them. Clara, surprisingly strong, hammered nails with a steady rhythm. Jed, his face grim with exhaustion, hauled beams and directed the men. He was surprised to see Clara working with the men, and a surge of pride went through him. Late in the afternoon, while taking a break, Jed found himself in a quiet moment alone with Clara. "Thank you," he said simply. Clara looked at him, her eyes tired but bright. "I'm not a helpless woman, Jedidiah. We're a family, and a family works together." He saw her then, not as a widow in need of a home, but as a partner. Her strength, her pride, her love for her daughter, all of it was a part of her, and all of it was a part of him now, too. They weren't a marriage of convenience anymore. They were just a marriage. A few days later, the barn was rebuilt, stronger than before. Jed and Clara stood together, watching the men ride away. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of gold and fire, a brilliant splash of color on the horizon. The two girls were running in the newly green pasture, their laughter a melody carried on the wind. Jed turned to Clara. "I made you a promise when we started this, that it would be a marriage of convenience." She nodded, her heart in her throat. "I was wrong," he said, taking her hand. His calloused fingers were rough against hers, but the touch was tender. "It's not for convenience anymore. It's for us, all of us." Clara looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw a man whose grief was now a shared burden, whose life was now a joined purpose. "I know," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "I know." He pulled her into his arms, and for the first time, a cowboy and a widow, two separate souls brought together by need, found their final peace not in a promise, but in a kiss. It was a kiss that sealed their new family, a promise of love, not just for their daughters, but for each other. The silence on the porch was different now. It was no longer the heavy silence of sorrow, but the charged stillness before a fight. Jed stared out at the darkening horizon, his fists clenched at his sides. "He's not just going to offer money," Jed said, his voice a low, rough rumble. "He'll start with fences. Then he'll push our cattle into his land. He's done it before." Clara placed a hand on his arm, her touch a steadying anchor. "Then we'll show him that this time he's dealing with a different kind of rancher." Jed turned to face her, his eyes searching hers. "And how do we do that, Clara?" "He has money and men. I've got a ranch and a new family." "You have something he doesn't have, Jedidiah," she said, her voice firm. "You have a community. Those men who rode in to help with the barn, they'll stand by you. He wants to isolate you, to make you feel like you're alone. We'll show him that you're not. The words were a balm to Jed's weary soul. They were also a stark reminder of the unspoken rules of the West. A man stood alone on his own land, but he survived with his neighbors. He looked at Clara and saw not just a partner, but a strategist, a woman who understood the lay of the land in a way he hadn't considered. The next morning, the girls were told that their parents were going on an important visit. Jed and Clara rode out, not in their wagon, but on horseback side by side. They visited every neighboring ranch, from the sprawling fields of the O'Connell family to the small homestead of Old Man Silas. Jed spoke little, letting Clara's clear voice explain the situation. "Silas Thorne is making a play for Jed's land," she would say, her chin held high. "He's testing us. If he succeeds in running Jed off, who will be next? We need to stand together against him." The response was immediate and fierce. The same men who had swung hammers and saws to rebuild the barn now offered to ride patrols. They promised to keep an eye on Jed's fences and his herd. Their loyalty was a shield, forged in a common understanding of the harsh and unforgiving land they all called home. But Thorne was not a man to be deterred by a simple show of solidarity. The intimidation began subtly at first. Fences were cut in the dead of night, not so much to let cattle out as to force Jed to spend time and resources on repairs. A few days later, a fire was set in a small copse of trees at the edge of his property, easily put out but a clear warning. One afternoon, as Jed and Clara were checking the northern pasture, two of Thorne's hired men rode up, their faces hard and expressionless. One of them, a man with a scarred cheek, pulled up his horse and stared at Jed. "Thorne sends his regards, Stone," the man said, his voice dripping with menace. "He hopes you and your new family are enjoying the ranch while it's still yours." The words were a punch to the gut. Jed felt Clara tense beside him. He kept his hands steady on the reins, his eyes locked on the men. "My land, my family, and my life are my own," Jed said, his voice low and dangerous. "You can tell Mr. Thorne that a man can't buy a home, and he can't scare one away." The scarred man laughed, a short, humorless sound. "We'll see about that." They rode off, leaving Jed and Clara alone in the dust. The sun was setting, casting long, menacing shadows across their land. Clara turned to Jed, her hand reaching for his. "He's testing us, and we're showing him we won't back down. We'll keep on fighting him." "It's not just a fight for the land," Jed said, looking out over the fields that now felt like a battlefield. "It's a fight for our family." And as they rode home, with the last light of day fading behind them, they knew that the real storm had only just begun. The peace they had so carefully built would have to be defended, one small victory at a time. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe. Likes and comment, turn on notification for the next episode.